Hello and welcome again to this video, the fourth and final part looking at stories from the Quran's 18th chapter, Surat Al-Kahf, aka the chapter of the cave. This video will look at the origins of some of these stories, in particular over the adventures of a man called the Man with Two Horns, which in Arabic is Dhul Qarnayn. In the past couple of videos, I looked at Dhul Qarnayn's bizarre adventures in the Quran, where he sees the sun setting into a muddy spring and later builds a huge barrier to keep out two huge and troublesome tribes called Gog and Magog. The Quran never named this man with two horns, and Muslims have argued ever since who this person with the two horns is. Some have concluded it is Alexander the Great, some say it's Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, while others prefer not to speculate altogether. I deliberately avoided referring to this in the past two videos as I felt it was important to try and focus on the absurdities of the stories themselves and not get sidetracked into something less important. But digging deeper into the character of Dhul Qarnayn is very interesting in itself, as it once again shows us how stories, almost universally considered today as legends with barely any historical truth to them, made their way into the Quran and other Islamic texts. Having read the different versions of what remains of the Alexander Romance legends, some of which have been lost over time, I am in no doubt that the character of Dhul Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran was based on the legendary Alexander stories, made up by those who idolized him, not the historical Alexander or any other character. So, who was Alexander the Great? Well, in brief, he was a skilled Macedonian leader/general who managed to conquer much of the known world at the time, his empire eventually stretching from Egypt and Macedonia in the west to modern-day Pakistan and Tajikistan in the east. Born in 356 BC, Alexander was born into a life of privilege and even had Aristotle as his tutor. He revered Cyrus the Great to such an extent that upon conquering Persia, he began to embrace many cultural aspects of Persian life, as well as claiming divinity and ordering his subjects to bow down to him in ancient Persian fashion called proskinesis. Proskinesis was a Persian method of worship. Let me ask the Muslims watching this, does this look familiar? Except for the last stage of Persian proskinesis, with the entire body lying face down, it's pretty much exactly what Muslim prayers eventually became as well. Remember that next time you're in a mosque. You're simply seeing an ancient Persian ritual of worship, not something new and unique to Islam. Anyway, I digress. So, before setting out to conquer Asia, Alexander brought along the well-known historian of his era, Callisthenes of Olynthus. He wanted Callisthenes to record his exploits and the march of the Macedonian army east. But Alexander's attitude and growing arrogance were not always well received by the Macedonians around him. Callisthenes was one of those who came to despise much of Alexander's behavior, in particular his demand for others to worship him. Callisthenes was imprisoned until his death in 327 BC. His historical works were all but destroyed. 4 years later, Alexander died at the age of 32 in Babylon. Having won every single battle during his life, crushing a once giant Persian empire and creating the largest empire the world had ever seen at that stage in history, Alexander inevitably became a legend. Stories were created to portray him in an ever more flattering light almost immediately after his death, with tales of his adventures growing more and more spectacular as time progressed. But which came first? Did the Alexander Romance stories predate Islam, or was Islam first in revealing these stories? Historians have effectively reached a consensus that the Alexander Romance stories are effectively nothing more than fables falsely attributed to Callisthenes. They began circulating orally soon after Alexander's death. Hundreds of years later, these fables were written down in Greece and Egypt around 200 AD. Ernest Wallace Budge, a British Egyptologist and curator, writes the following in the History of Alexander the Great. The first book of the history of Alexander, according to Pseudo-Callisthenes, is certainly of Egyptian origin, and its birthplace was Alexandria. Colonel Yule places the composition of the work as far back as AD 200. But there is no doubt that the legends which are contained in it were current some hundreds of years before. Indeed, some of them must have been known within a few years of Alexander's death. The stories from these versions and the oral traditions led to more versions arriving. But given the geography and incredibly strong trade links in the region, if these myths were written down in Greece and Egypt by 200 AD, then the oral tradition would have almost certainly been very strong in Arabia by that time, and for a few hundred years later, long before Islam was born. Some Muslims may claim certain versions of the Alexander Romance were physically written down around the same time, or a little later than when the Quranic verses were revealed. That simply ignores the fact that there were many versions, and ignores the fact that the legends most likely began as folklore, and were well known to people through word of mouth before they were eventually written down. Even within Islam itself, the hadiths and the seerah were only written down a couple of hundred years after the stories and sayings allegedly occurred. We also saw in an earlier video how the Quran appears to borrow the idea of the sun setting into a muddy spring from a pre-Islamic poem by Tubba, as evidenced in early Islamic sources which tried to give the verse legitimacy. This shows that the legends from this man with the two horns were in Arabic poems long before Islam was even founded. So it's clear that the myths regarding the man with the two horns were prevalent in society sometime prior to the birth of Islam. Even the Quran itself lends credibility to the idea that these stories were around before the Quran. As we saw in the first video analysing chapter 18, Muhammad was challenged to recall a number of stories to prove his prophethood. He requested one day to get back to them, took 2 weeks, blamed it on God getting grumpy because Muhammad didn't say inshallah, and then told them their answers in the vaguest way possible. But it's not just the hadiths providing context to this verse that shows this was the case. The Dhul Qarnayn story in the Quran actually begins with the verse 1883. And they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I will recite to you an account of him. So it's clear he was asked about the story known to them at the time, and that would have been the prevalent local version of the Alexander romance. So let's see what was said in these fables and where there are similarities to the Quran, hadith or exegeses. For starters, the origins of the name of Two-Horned One, which is exactly how the Quran refers to him, makes several appearances in these legends. It appears to have originated from the Egyptian version, which, like other versions, tried to claim Alexander as their own, claiming he was part of their family of gods. This hieroglyphic message apparently reads, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, the chosen one of Ra, the beloved of Amen, son of the sun, Alexander, son of Amen. Now the author here says, being the son of the god Amen, who was frequently represented on the sculptures by a ram, it was only natural that the two horns of this animal should be made attributes of Alexander the Great, and that he should be called two-horned. In the Ethiopic version, we are given another reason. His title, Two-Horned, occurs for the first time in this manuscript in this address. The Ethiopic writers explain this title by saying that he was so called because he ruled in the two horns of the sun, the east and the west. In the Christian version, we have yet another version to explain the origin of the name. And the king arose and knelt down and did reverence to the Lord. And the Lord said to him, Behold, I have magnified thee above all kingdoms, and I have made horns of iron to grow on thy head, that thou mayest thrust down the kingdoms of the earth with them. So we can already see the evidence is pointing very strongly that the so-called two-horned man was referring to Alexander across the region when Islam was born. He was known by this name in Egypt, Ethiopia, and among Christians. If the Quran meant someone else, then it would be deliberately misleading. So what else do we see in these mythical legends? Here we have Alexander's father, King Philip, predict this. When Philip saw Alexander guiding the horse with his hand and standing upon his feet, he said, My son Alexander, the whole oracle refers to thee. I believe that after my death thou wilt reign, and that thou wilt rule the world. So Alexander's father says he will rule the world. In the second Quranic verse on Dhul Qarnayn, we hear the following. Verily, we established his power on earth, and we gave him the ways and the means to all ends. We can see by reading the well-respected exegesis of Ibn Kathir that this is given to mean he controlled the world. So he had dominion over the east and the west. All countries and their kings submitted to him, and all the nations, Arab and non-Arab, served him. In his exegesis of another verse, he states a narration which confirms Dhul Qarnayn was one of 4 people who managed to rule the world. The kings who ruled the eastern and western parts of the world are 4, 2 believers and 2 disbelievers. As for the 2 believing kings, they were Sulaiman bin Dawood and Dhul Qarnayn. As for the 2 disbelieving kings, they were Nimrud and Nebuchadnezzar. Apparently, nobody told these people about the yet undiscovered Americas or half of Eurasia. It just goes to show how local the Abrahamic religions were. Some of these so-called kings didn't even rule 10% of the inhabited world at the time, let alone all of it. Let's see what else was said in these legends that the Quran picks up. We have Alexander speaking to those around him here of things he would like to see for himself. I am wondering what is the extent of the earth and how high the heavens are, and how many are the countries of my fellow kings, and upon what the heavens are fixed. Whether perchance thick clouds and winds support them, or whether pillars of fire rise up from the interior of the earth and bear the heavens so that they move not for anything, or whether they depend on the beck of God and fall not. He speaks about wanting to see the extent of the earth in the legends, and the Quran tells us in chapter 18 that Dhul Qarnayn travels on routes to the west and the east. Alexander in the legends also says he wants to understand how the sky above earth doesn't fall down onto it. He ponders whether it is kept up by pillars or whether God keeps them held up magically above us. The Quran attempts to answer these primitive questions, and not surprisingly, its author appears to have a similar mindset here that is not different from the mythical legends. Allah is He who raised the heavens without any pillars that you see. We also see this verse. Do you not see that Allah has made subservient to you whatsoever is in the earth and the ships running in the sea by His command? And He withholds the heaven from falling on the earth except with His permission. So as we can see from these Quranic verses, the sky is being held up above our heads. It would fall down onto us if it weren't for God keeping it up. Now we also see that Alexander went to see the sun rising on the edges of the world. The sun is the servant of the Lord, and neither by night nor by day does he cease from his travelling. The place of his rising is over the sea, and the people who dwell there, when he is about to rise, flee away and hide themselves in the sea, that they be not burnt by his rays. Quran chapter 18 verse 90 reads, "Until when he reached the land of the rising sun, he found it rising on a people to whom we had given no shelter from it." As we can see, the Quran agrees with the Alexander myths that the sun rises over a people who have no protection from its rays. On the same page we also read, "And when the sun enters the window of heaven, he straightway bows down and makes obeisance before God his creator." This idea of the sun and other celestial objects being conscious and worshipping Allah is seen several times in the Quran and Hadith. "Hast thou not seen that unto Allah payeth adoration, whosoever is in the heavens and whosoever is in the earth, and the sun and the moon and the stars and the hills and the trees and the beasts and many of mankind?" We now arrive at the story of Gog and Magog. I addressed the Islamic narrative of this myth in the last video. The Quran basically tells us this man with two horns, Dhul-Qarnayn, goes to find a people who are annoyed with these troublesome tribes and ask him for help to keep these troublemakers trapped behind two mountains, so they won't cause them any more problems. Let's briefly read those verses again. "Then he followed another course, until when he reached a place between the two mountains, he found on that side of them a people who could hardly understand a word. They said, 'O Dhul-Qarnayn, surely Gog and Magog make mischief in the land. Shall we then pay you a tribute on condition that you should raise a barrier between us and them?' He said, 'That in which my Lord has established me is better. Therefore you only help me with workers. I will make a fortified barrier between you and them. Bring me blocks of iron.' Until when he had filled up the space between the two mountain sides, he said, 'Blow.' Until when he had made it as fire, he said, 'Bring me molten brass, which I may pour over it.' So they were not able to scale it, nor could they make a hole in it." So that's the Quranic version, but we read here in the Alexander myths that he reaches a people near a large mountain who are having problems with what they call the Huns. Alexander said, "Who are the nations within this mountain upon which we are looking?" The natives of the land said, "They are the Huns." He said to them, "Who are their kings?" The old men said, "Gog and Magog," and then they go on to list more names who are behind the mountains. Now that is very similar to the story in the Quran. Is it just a pure coincidence? I mean, so far, both the Alexander myths and the Quran say a man known as the man with two horns travelled all over the world. Both say he saw the sun rising above a people who had no shelter from it. Both say he went to mountains to see a people who were complaining about Gog and Magog. Now the Quran says he used iron and brass to build the barrier to keep Gog and Magog out. So let's see what materials were used in the myth to keep Gog and Magog at bay. Alexander commanded and fetched 3,000 smiths, workers in iron, and 3,000 men, workers in brass. And they put down brass and iron, and kneaded it as a man kneads when he works clay. Then they brought it and made a gate. Now, in the Quran, we also hear that Gog and Magog will break free from their incarceration towards the end of time and cause havoc on earth, an idea supported in the authentic hadiths. The verse says, "Until the Gog and Magog people are let through their barrier, and they swiftly swarm from every hill." Now the Alexander myth also tells us Gog and Magog will be released towards the end of time and also take over the world. "When the world shall come to an end by the command of God, the ruler of creation, created things shall anger God, and sin shall increase, and wrath shall reign, and the sins of mankind shall mount up and shall cover the heavens. And the Lord will stir up in his anger the kingdoms that lie within this gate. For when the Lord seeks to slay men, he sends men against men, and they destroy one another. And the Lord will gather together the kings and their hosts which are within this mountain, and they shall be assembled at his beck, and shall come with their spears and swords, and shall stand behind the gate, and shall look up to the heavens, and shall call upon the name of the Lord, saying, O Lord, open to us this gate. And the Lord shall send his sign from heaven, and a voice shall call on this gate, and it shall be destroyed and fall at the beck of the Lord." What we just read also encapsulates this idea in an authentic hadith, which tells us the barrier will be breached after they ask nicely to Allah. Until when their time has come and Allah wants to send them against the people, they will dig until they can almost see the rays of the sun. Then the one who is in charge of them will say, "Go back and we will dig it tomorrow if Allah wills." So they will say, if Allah wills, then they will come back to it and it will be as they left it. So they will dig and will come out to the people. There are many more instances of similarities, but I don't want to go on forever as the point has been made. These other similarities include a mention of people who have the heads of dogs. The Alexander myths also say Jesus will return before the end of the world and set up base in Jerusalem where Gog and Magog will not go. The myths speak about the Antichrist and how he will be killed by Jesus. I will put the references for everything, including these last ones, in the description box for those who wish to read further and see the similarities for themselves. So, as we've seen, the similarities between the made-up mythical accounts of Alexander the Great and the character of Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran are obvious. We also saw similar answers to the primitive questions that had obviously baffled desert dwellers at the time, like how does the sky stay up and not come crashing down? Is this all a coincidence? Why would the Quran use so much of the mythical stories of Alexander, nothing more than made-up stories bearing little resemblance to actual history? By believing these stories, Muhammad, or whoever else authored the Quran, caused huge problems for the religion. Now Muslims have to come up with lengthy, nonsensical excuses to explain the verses about the sun setting and rising near people here on earth. They also have to tell us why we can't see this great wall of iron and brass. These stories and many others have made Islam simply indistinguishable from any other mythology. Early Muslims in general had no real problem in identifying Dhul Qarnayn as Alexander the Great, but as time progressed and it became more evident that the historical Alexander was a polytheist and even wanted people to bow down to him, Muslims have started to switch the identity of Dhul Qarnayn from what we clearly see is of the mythical Alexander to Cyrus the Great, or just preferring to say he's a man who ruled the world but we don't know who he is, as if suggesting historians and archaeologists would miss such an empire completely. So why are today's Muslims often so quick to tell us Dhul Qarnayn is not Alexander? Well, simply because they presuppose that Islam is right and base their conclusions on that presupposition. They don't bother looking objectively at the evidence and seeing where it leads. No, instead they'll say it can't be Alexander because he wasn't righteous and the Quran states Dhul Qarnayn was a believer.
Also, there is this Islamic legend that is very popular that Dhul Qarnayn is somehow Alexander the Great. And the fact of the matter is that there is not a shred of Islamic or historical evidence that links Alexander the Great with Dhul Qarnayn. In fact, quite the contrary, there's a number of things that do not fit at all with Alexander the Great and Dhul Qarnayn. The most important of them, Allah describes Dhul Qarnayn as being a pious Muslim, a good man, as a rajul salih, as Ibn Abbas said. And we know historically beyond a shadow of a doubt that Alexander the Great was a pagan idolater. He was an idol worshipper. His teacher was none other than Aristotle. Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander the Great. This is literally historically. Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. And these people were not believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believed in a pagan religion. So Alexander the Great has nothing to do with the story of Dhul Qarnayn. Who was he then? Allahu A'lam. People, if you look at the books of tafsir, they give all of these stories, and really in the end of the day, these are simply Islamic legends. There's no shred of evidence in the Quran and Sunnah, and the more details we go into that are unnecessary, the more trouble we put ourselves into. Let's stick with the Quranic story and don't go too much into the details that Allah did not care to tell us about because they're not relevant.
See that? He realizes too many questions over this story of the Quran will lead to problems. But why should it if it were true? Why should it lead to problems if the Quran is indeed a perfect book? Surely analyzing a so-called perfect book and believers trying to understand the stories contained within this scripture shouldn't lead anyone to face problems. This apologist basically begins with his conclusion that the Quran is perfect and tries his best to make everything fit so it can remain consistent with his conclusion. This is not the way any academic assessing the Quran's claims objectively would look at the issue. Instead, one would look at the data and the evidence, and in this case it's pretty strong, and conclude that the story appears to be taken from a mythical legend circulating at the time. But obviously a Muslim just cannot admit that. He just has to shrug his shoulders and say God knows, and then advises others not to dig too deep into it and just sweep it under the carpet. Some Muslims today claim it's Cyrus the Great who was Dhul Qarnayn. They'll tell us this based purely on this one picture of a sculpture showing Cyrus with horns and also with wings. But was Cyrus ever known by the name Dhul Qarnayn as Alexander clearly was? Did Cyrus travel to the edges of the earth and witness the sun rising on a people who had no protection from it? Did Cyrus imprison Gog and Magog behind a barrier made of iron and brass? It really is a no-brainer to see what the origin of these stories that made it into the Quran is. Even when looking at the Quran, we can see that Muhammad wasn't really fooling many people around him with the stories. And when it is said to them, believe as the people believe, they shall say, shall we believe as the fools believe? This appears to show that the first people who entered Islam were seen as fools by the rest for being gullible. And in another verse we read this, and they say, the stories of the ancients, he has got them written, so these are read out to him morning and evening. This shows Muhammad was accused at his time of plagiarizing ancient tales and myths. If you're a Muslim and you've made it this far in without stopping the video, leaving an angry comment, disliking and leaving, then I urge you to think hard. I know facing a bitter hard truth is not easy. I know it's far easier to let your bias dismiss any contrary evidence to your belief instead of asking the tough questions. Does it make sense that an all-knowing God would leave his one true religion to be open to so many apparent flaws? Would a true religion and a perfect scripture really require a horde of apologists to make endless and often nonsensical excuses to try and twist the narrative into something more believable? Surely a perfect religion can speak for itself and wouldn't require any apologists. Surely it's time to rethink whether you were one of the few lucky ones who were born into the right religion and into the right sect within that religion. Thank you very much for watching. Share this video where you can, and until next time, goodbye.